This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Core Brain Journal. It's a place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street.
Well, welcome, folks. Here we are, Dr. Charles Parker, one more time at Core Brain Journal. You will be terribly excited about this meeting. This is episode 061. We've got Dave Siever coming into us from somewhere in Canada. Dave, we'll ask you in just a minute. Welcome.
Hi, Chuck. How are you?
So what part of Canada are you in, Dave?
Well, we're in the western side. We're east of the Rockies, about 4 hours drive. We're straight north of Montana, 300 miles.
So what town are you in?
Edmonton.
Edmonton. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to introduce you briefly. Honestly, folks, I'm going to tell you right now, we've had a number of individuals who are terribly interesting here at Core Brain Journal, talking about different types of brain injury and ways to actually manipulate the brain. 046 episode was Alex Domain. He was talking about music healing. We have one coming up after Dave Siever here. 062 is Dr. George Lindenfeld. I'm going to tell you right now, folks, we're very interested in this because we see it all the time. I'm from Virginia Beach. We're in a large military region, and Dave is going to tell us some information that is going to be really revolutionary. Really, it's very, very interesting. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. He's been in the he's an engineering technologist, graduated in 78. In 84, he began to design biofeedback devices. He's currently CEO of a group called Mind Alive Inc. I'm going to leave the URL there in the show notes. But what's really interesting, he's going to tell us about extremely interesting acronyms that many of you listeners, including myself, don't know about, that are absolutely relevant in brain injury, but go all the way down to all kinds of subsets of things that happen with brain injury. We're going to get a lot of different information. The good news, this is a recording, so you can listen to it again. And Dave, what I want to do is just take a moment for you to tell our audience who you are personally, elaborate a little bit on that quick introduction, and then we'll get into your background and go from there.
Sure. I should mention, too, I have a little bit of a cold, so hopefully I won't be clearing my throat too many times.
You sound great.
Great. Yes, so basically I'm trained in electronics, and back in 1981 or so, I landed a job at the University of Alberta, and it was my job to build a research lab for TMJ dysfunction. Or TMD, they call it nowadays, temporomandibular dysfunction. People with jaw pain and often headaches and neck pain and so on. And while I was building the research lab, I had to build a device that could measure basically EMG off of jaw closing muscles like the masseter temporalis and so on. And when the teeth touch, there's temporary paralysis that goes on. And that's your brain's way, it's through the trigeminal ganglion, which you probably know, but the listeners don't, but it's in the side of our cheeks, this little nerve complex. Anyway, the brain, it paralyzes the muscles temporarily to keep us from breaking our teeth every time we close our jaw together. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I built a little device that could measure that paralysis period. And what we found, what was interesting, Edmonton's a big oil town. And in the 80s, oil was down to $15 a barrel. And I did a life event scale on 500 of our patients and discovered almost all of them were wives of oil workers. Mm. And 3 to 6 months prior to having TMJ pain, they noted an increase in arguments with spouse and financial worries. Mm. Now, how this plays in is that when a person has a really good bite and they bring their teeth together, this silent period, they call it, is about 20 milliseconds long. But if a person has a really bad bite and the teeth are banging around because their teeth are all crooked and stuff, the occlusion is off, that could be 50, 60, 70 milliseconds long. And what we found was that if they had a long silent period, a splint worked pretty good at resolving their jaw pain and their TMJ issues. But most of our patients all had short silent periods, and the splints would never work. Then I started getting involved in biofeedback and taking them over to the biofeedback lab and putting them on biofeedback. And then we started discovering, of course, that a lot of this was stress-based. It wasn't dental-based at all. And the other thing was that when OPEC put an embargo on oil in about 1988, and oil suddenly shot up to $25, $30 a barrel, most of our patients disappeared.
Interesting.
Yes, it was very interesting. Meanwhile, I started making electrostimulators way back in 1981, and I was selling them to dentists to help relax jaws and stuff that were tense. But also, I got into the audio-visual entrainment, which is the flashing lights and the sounds meant to drive brainwaves.
Now, take a moment to tell our audience what entrainment is. That's a word you use all the time, but I know a lot of us don't know what entrainment is.
Yeah, entrainment basically means any stimuli that causes a biological response that is in rhythm with the stimuli is considered entrainment. Old terms were frequency following response or evoked potentials and things like this, but the more modern term nowadays is entrainment. So if you flash lights in the eyes at, let's say, 14 flashes per second, you should see a 14 hertz rhythm start to show up in the brain. And or sounds, tactile. You can do it with tactile too, stimulating fingers. If you can clap your hands real fast, you can get a little response in the motor strip as well from that. All of our senses, except for smell, run through the thalamus. The thalamus is basically the gateway keeper of all of our senses, except for smell. And the thalamus is the main oscillator with the neurons of our brain that make alpha waves. And this is really critical information to know this. So as soon as we close our eyes, the brain doesn't have nearly as much to do anymore, and alpha waves go way up. And we see them on the EEG all the time. If you meditate, you make a lot of alpha waves. Gazing in front of a fire and kind of drifting off, you'll make a lot of alpha waves. We always make alpha before we fall asleep. Alpha is a very healthy, healing brainwave if we make it willingly, but if we can't turn it off, it's also very pathological. So it's both good and bad depending on when it occurs. In the old days, everybody was talking about altered states of consciousness and trying to get into alpha, and everybody thought it was good, but now they found ADD, cognitive decline, head injuries, dementia, all involved, huge levels of alpha that people can't control. So as long as alpha is controllable, it's healthy, but if it's not controllable, it's unhealthy. But it's also the main oscillator with the cortex, and that's where some of this new research that I'm doing is playing into that.
So, and then let's talk about that new research. Let's get a couple more acronyms squared away, Dave, if you don't mind, because, we hit a little bit. Let's talk about AVE. We've alluded to it, but let's really get down to AVE, which is a specialization of you and your company.
Yes, AVE, audio-visual entrainment, is kind of a subset of brainwave entrainment in general, which would include tactile or kinesthetic entrainment. So AVE is really the presentation of flashing lights in the eyes in a pair of sunglasses that we use, and also pulsing tones. And they're meant to drive brainwaves. And the premise, originally has always been to drive brainwaves at the frequency that your stimulation is coming off at. And this was discovered way back in 1934. However, studies since then have shown that it does other things. It increases nitric oxide. It causes vasodilatation in the brain, really ups cerebral blood flow. A study showed that it was up to 28% increases in cerebral blood flow. And a lot of disorders involve the hypoperfusion of cerebral blood flow, like ADD, dementia, ADHD, depression. A lot of things, the blood flow is hypoperfused, so entrainment naturally increases it. It also dissociates people, and this is particularly important for anxiety, post-traumatic stress. So when people put the gear on and they've got millions of thoughts going on because they're all stressed out, they're full of norepinephrine, their serotonin has crashed, and they've got a racy head syndrome. And entrainment often puts people in the deep, deep trances, very similar to an accomplished meditator would do. And it gives them peace for a while from their own thoughts. It also has been shown to increase serotonin 23% in half an hour, and endorphins 18%, norepinephrine 13%, all in half an hour. So it helps to rebalance neurotransmitters when they've gone way off, typically from stress and anxiety. So it does a lot of things. It does other things too, but these are the primary things that entrainment does.
Well, let me ask you a quick question on it, Dave, because this is so darn interesting. Speaking as a psychiatrist, you're using terms that we're running around constantly trying to use medication to correct. We want, and the medications all are driving towards different neurotransmitters. And what you're saying is, in a very short period of time, audiovisual entrainment can significantly affect many of the things we're trying to affect by throwing meds at the person and trying to make a change that way.
It is an excellent non-drug approach to a lot of things, yes. And we've got studies on depression, anxiety. I collected so much research over the years, I ended up teaching a course at Siever University out of California. So now I have a PhD level course there. And we teach all of this stuff there. But yes, depression, anxiety, insomnia, cognitive issues. We have several senior studies. The latest one came out of, it was a dissertation by a grad student at Siever University out of near San Francisco, San Rafael. And she also did EEGs on seniors. And one of the things they found was that as we age, our brainwaves start to slow down. And there's a direct correlation with cognitive decline and dementia and brainwave frequency, which is not good. As your brainwave slows down, that's not a good thing. So fortunately, she did a double-blind study, and she used EEG and looked at the brainwave, the dominant alpha rhythms. And the average age of the group was 68 years of age. And then she trained them using our gear for 1 month. And at the end of the month, she re-EEG'd them to look at their brainwaves. She also did memory tests, and immediate and delayed memory improved very significantly, which is another good thing because memory losses with dementia are common, right?
Oh, yes.
So immediate memory doubled, 200% increase, and about a 40% increase in delayed memory. But one of the things that was most fascinating is when she looked at their EEGs, a month later, they sped up. And basically, the 68-year-old average population now had the brainwave frequencies of a 50-year-old.
Wow.
So it took, excuse me, took 20 years off their brain age.
Very, very interesting. So let me
ask, I got a cough here.
You go ahead. I think winter is set in up in Canada.
Oh, just give me a sec here.
No, that's okay. Catch your breath. Not a problem.
Hope you can edit that out.
No, I'll try to. I'll get the guy on it, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. This is reality for us.
Oh man. Okay, I think I'm back.
I wish I could give you a drink of water right here through the video.
Yes, indeed.
So back to this kinesthetic point, because you were raising some exceedingly interesting points there, Dave. The kinesthetic point, does EMDR have something to do with what you're talking about for post-traumatic stress?
Sort of. EMDR works more on the brainstem level. Sorry. Entrainment does affect the brain somewhat globally, but mostly it's affecting it on a cortical level.
Okay.
Through the cortex.
Well, catch your breath. I got another one that I want to ask you about, and that's CES, because cranio-electrostimulation products is what does that mean? Because we're not familiar with that vocabulary.
Yes, cranio-electrostimulation has been around for a long, long time. Most of it involves putting ear clips, one on each ear, and putting a little pulse current through the brain. And it primarily hits the brainstem. I've got a great article on our website on CES, and I show an image of where the current drives through the brain, where the electric fields are, and it hits the brainstem quite a bit. Well, of course, the brainstem, produces four main neurotransmitters: acetylcholine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and endorphins. And studies of CES have shown that serotonin and endorphin levels have gone up as much as 200%.
Wow.
Very quickly.
It's amazing. So then, we're coming to an important acronym that you and I were talking about before we actually started talking here. It was so very interesting, and we're going to have, this is going to be the paper that Dave has passed on to us as a download. It's going to be at corebrainjournal.com/061 download. And it's on the acronym DAI. And if you could give us the background again on that, Dave, I thought it was such an interesting story. And a narrative is not a story. I don't like the word story. It's just the way you put that together. And that discovery is dramatic. It's very interesting.
Yes, and it's been an exciting discovery for me. And I just finished this 45-page report on it just recently, because I'm hoping that the medical establishment will start to grasp the importance of this. But basically, medically, diffuse axonal injuries, well, first of all, a diffuse axonal injury or interruption, everybody's called it an injury. I'm calling them interruptions because a lot of them really aren't injuries. And they can't see them on an MRI. And that's been one of the issues with medicine is most of the time they can't see this on an MRI. And they don't know really how, if someone has, well, first of all, let me back up a bit. These are a kind of an injury that happens when the head gets shaken. So car accidents, sports, a lot of sporting. I mean, when you see all about those concussion injuries and stuff from sport athletes, a lot of this stuff is from getting their head banged around a lot, especially in football players.
Even whiplash, I would assume, Dave.
Absolutely. Yep. Whiplash, falling on sidewalks, on ice, or anything that where you fall and you really shake your head. Children falling downstairs or falling down steps as youngsters can knock off all these neurons. And so it's called a diffuse axonal injury or diffuse axonal interruption. Fevers can cause it. And that's interesting in itself. That's never been really recognized by the industry that fevers can cause this as well. But basically, it interrupts that cortical thalamic loop. And that cortical thalamic loop is where our alpha wave comes from. And the distance from the cortex to the thalamus is probably about 2.5 inches or so in most people. And then 2.5 inches back. And as soon as the way they say, basically to get an alpha rhythm is to meditate or close your eyes and meditate. As soon as you disengage your neurons from a cognitive task, so they're not talking to each other all the time. When you're engaged on reading or math or doing things cognitively, the neurons are all communicating with each other and you don't really see any alpha in the brainwave. But when you close your eyes and you relax, alpha waves should start coming in. And that's through this cortical thalamic loop. So when the neurons have nothing to do, they basically send a signal down to the thalamus, and they kind of say, hey, thalamus, what you doing? Thalamus says, well, not doing much. How about you? I'm not doing much. How about you? Not doing much. How about you? And they do this loop back and forth. And it's about 5 inches all together in this loop. And it takes 100 milliseconds to complete it, which is 10 cycles per second. And that's a healthy alpha rhythm. Most population make a very healthy 10 cycles per second. If it gets slower, you start getting into special needs and all kinds of cognitive and emotional problems. If it gets faster, people get very, very sharp. If an alpha rhythm is running at 11 or 12 or 13 cycles per second, those people are very sharp, but they're prone to severe anxiety because their brains start too fast. So 10 hertz is right around where a nice optimal frequency for an alpha rhythm. But what happens when the brain gets shaken, the brain goes off into an inflammation stage. There may be a little bit of tearing. Now, most of this is occurring in the white matter. And all of our neurons, of course, are sheathed with a myelin sheath, which is fat, which is why it's white. And there's long axons running off the neurons to the thalamus, and then there's projections going back up. Again, long axons. I mean, we're talking 2.5 inches of space here, roughly, in a lot of, for most people. And so they get to be interruptions. On an MRI, you'll see little breaks in those layers. But most of the time, you never see it on an MRI. It doesn't exist. So the neurons are there, and the connections are there, but they're taken offline. And so after an injury, the brain has a tendency to have inflammation, and it takes billions of neurons offline to protect itself while it's healing. The thing is, under the use it or lose it principle, once they're offline, they have a tendency to stay offline, and they don't come back. Now they need a boost to get them back. And this is where my story kind of really comes in. We've been looking at the model of entrainment for a long time, more from the frequency driving perspective. If someone doesn't make alpha, we try to give them 10 hertz alpha, boost up their alpha. And for a lot of people, I mean, there's a whole population of people out there who have a lot of stress and anxiety and stuff. And under stress and anxiety, the alpha goes way down, beta goes up. And you see this imbalanced ratio. When they close their eyes, their brain is still too racy, so their alpha doesn't come up.
So they're really, when their eyes are closed, they're still top beta. They're beta topping out.
That's right. And they can't relax. They have all kinds of sleep disorders, right? And that happens in all kinds of people in the population nowadays. So they have a tendency to drink or smoke pot or something like that to try to get their alpha beta ratios more in line. You see this in trauma a great deal, and you see this, of course, in chronic fatigue syndrome, where people are really norepinephrine. Our brain's adrenaline is high, cortisol is high in the urine if you do a urine sample, and so the brain can't settle down. People are overworked, overstressed. School kids, they just can't get that to shut down. Excuse me. So anyway, so that is the type of course, brain signature that relates to these people. But when you have a diffuse axonal injury, you still see low alpha and high beta, but from a totally different cause now. It's actually caused from a break in the communication paths between the neurons and the thalamus, not because people are worrying about too much stuff. Yeah, true, they do worry about stuff because their brain isn't working well, but it's really a physical thing that's going on now. And over all the decades, no one has differentiated the two, partly because the people who are stressed out still have communication between the thalamus and the cortex. So their neurons are still involved, even though they're not making alpha, but they're still involved doing stuff, like worrying and things like this. When you have this axonal interruption, the neurons are actually offline. And this has been one of the big stumbling blocks that I puzzled about for a long time, because I'm looking at their delta phase. Now, phase has to do with how synchronized are the neurons firing at different frequencies. And neurons fire, of course, in a certain synchronization at all the frequencies in the brain, including delta. But when I'm looking at a lot of my clients, there's a big mess in the delta phase section. In part of the brain, sometimes the whole brain, but usually it's a section of the brain is completely messed up compared to the rest of the brain. The phase is way out of alignment. And so I've been scratching my head over a long time trying to figure out why this is. Well, fortunately, I put the word out way back last winter to some of the neuropsychology guys that I know, like Robert Thatcher, Jay Gunkelman, and so on, and found some studies that show that when neurons get taken offline and they don't have a synchronization pulse anymore, they will start to fire on their own randomly. And that was really key to what I was seeing. So if you take a neuron and just put it in a Petri dish, it will start to fire at 1 or 2 pulses per second, all on its own, in the absence of a synchronization pulse. So when these people get this diffuse axonal interruption, not only is there no alpha because that loop has been taken out, but the neurons start firing randomly, so the delta phase is a mess because they're not coordinated anymore. They're just doing their own thing. So that was an important part of the signature. Plus, when they fire randomly, you get millions of neurons all firing at slightly different moments. It makes the beta look really choppy. So low alpha, delta phase problems, and a really choppy, rough-looking beta when you see it streaming off. And the paper I sent you, you'll see it. You'll see really rough-looking beta in these people. Now, the other thing that had gone on is the VA people, the Veterans Affairs people, have been using our gear for war vets for, 10, 15 years now. More for PTSD, but they're also noticing that there's been great cognitive improvements in the war vets too. Now, typically the model we would use would be to use alpha for PTSD and settle them down, because people with post-traumatic stress don't usually make alpha because they're all wound out. So you want to meditate them kind of back to earth and calm them down. But a lot of times they're using frequencies that we call SMR and beta. And SMR is the sensory motor rhythm frequency. And it's usually around 13, 14, 15 cycles per second, and beta is usually around 20-ish. And so beta is twice the frequency of the alpha rhythm that they would make. And so anyway, they're using these faster frequencies and they're getting relaxation and cognitive improvements. Well, we knew in our senior study that SMR beta works great for sharpening up a senior's brain. Studies have shown that SMR beta has increased grade point average in college students by 1 GPA. And we've got all that on our website as well, studies on that. But we didn't expect to see this happen in these people with the head injuries because they're not making alpha. So in the past, I'm trying to give them alpha, and it isn't really working because this loop, of course, is interrupted.
And that delta is jumping in there as well.
Yeah, and the delta phase is a mess and all that. So I started experimenting around with faster frequencies. I thought, what if we were to jumpstart the neurons? If we just really gave them a real hit of stimulation, could we excite them again? Maybe something would happen. So I started doing this to a few of my clients, and I'm giving them high-speed stimulation like beta, and the slow beta, which is SMR. And suddenly we're seeing alpha spindles popping out, and we're like, okay, that shouldn't happen. That doesn't jive with the theories of entrainment that the brain should mimic. Here I'm giving them 20 flashes per second or 20 stimuli per second, and the brain is clocking out beautiful 10 cycles per second at the half frequency. So you had to put the pieces of the puzzle together to start figuring out why this was working. And literally it comes down to because all of our senses go through the thalamus. So when we hammer the daylight side of it, it suddenly starts connecting and starts making alpha. The other thing is all these people have sleep disorders. They can't sleep because they don't make alpha. Well, they fall asleep in my chair with the EEG cap on their head. The lights are flashing in the eyes, the tones are pulsing in their ears, and they're in a room with a guy they've never met before, and they're sound asleep. So you see delta waves coming in, and then alpha, and then delta, then alpha, as they drift sort of out of deep trance meditation and sleep, back and forth like. And you see that all in the paper. I've got all the raw EEG shown in the paper. So, and then, and sometimes after the session ends, people sleep for half an hour extremely deeply because they're sleep deprived. And when the session ends, most of the time they go, wow, the bag's off my head. I can think clearly again. And that's exciting. But they'll go home and that night they'll sleep 11, 12 hours.
That's wild. Let me interrupt for a second and ask this question
Sure.
because this is all new to me, and I'm trying to also put it together for myself as well as our listeners. So a question occurs then. So you actually, it sounds almost like electroconvulsive therapy on a very targeted, much more direct, effective way. I don't know. We'll talk about that in a second. But it sounds like you kind of cranked up the betas across the board and have paradoxical effect in that that cranked beta then actually diminished the delta and synchronized the alpha that was looking for it.
Yes, Jay Gunkelman, a neuropsychologist that I know well, said it looks similar, in his mind, it's similar to putting paddles on a heart that after a heart attack, you put paddles on it and you jumpstart it. Yeah. You got to get the sync pulse, the electrical pulses back in synchronization or excited again and get them going. So he called it paddles for the brain. Oh, yeah. But yes, we didn't expect, it was a very paradoxical effect. We never expected it to occur. But it also really helped us to differentiate how to treat those who are low alpha, high beta is very different than the diffuse axonal interruption low alpha, high beta types. They're very different. And you got to look at the delta phase, and you got to look at this choppiness in the beta as another factor. But mostly it's the bad delta phase that's the really telling part of that signature. And we would treat them, of course, differently.
So you've had some specific, this is very scientific and very deep for a lot of our listeners. Give us a little bit of a true life example of somebody you've either treated or know about who came in, and you had a little bit, they were talking there about the sleep, but give us an example of, here's the problem, here's how it was resolved, here's what we did.
Yes, well, in that paper, I've got 3 cases outlined in that paper. And basically, the reason why I outlined 3 very diverse cases was because this professor at this concussion conference I was at, professor of psychology, they said, if someone has a pre-existing condition, depression, anxiety, this, that, would you treat that pre-existing condition before you treat the diffuse axonal interruption? And he said, yes. And I was like, no, that is the most wrong answer we could expect, because there's a spectrum of disorders that I've discovered, all relating to the same cause. So, but I never really documented my people well. And of course, the VA centers never ran EEGs, but they did know that when people had those concussive injuries, from explosions and stuff, that shock wave that hits you causes these injuries. and that the entrainment was fixing him up, but they never had EEG backing to to know what was going on. So anyway,
wow.
In this paper, I looked at an anorexic who had a real fever at one point in life, a binge alcoholic. Now, he was interesting, and a lady who was 5 years post motor vehicle accident. And she had not worked for 5 years. The psychiatry industry gave her a real runaround, told her it was all in her head, and she was just trying to milk the system and stuff like this. And so she hadn't worked for 5 years. 3 weeks of entrainment. One of the things, they're in litigation against the guy who hit her car, and for pretty much an entire year, her lawyers have been bugging her to write a victim impact statement. She hadn't got a title started because she just had no focus or attention. 3 weeks of entrainment, she wrote a 15-page report.
Wow.
And now she's employed again and everything. So she's extremely happy. Now the guy who was the binge alcoholic, and again, so many people say, well, binge alcoholics, they just got to get their act together, they got to smarten up. They're just, low lifes or this or that.
That's what happens.
Well, this binge alcoholic came in because he's a binge alcoholic and he wanted to get his brainwaves looked at. And I'm looking at his brainwaves. And fortunately, I'd already now been documenting diffuse axonal interruptions. And I went, whoa, you've got a huge diffuse axonal injury here. And I said, you've had a serious hit to your head at some point in your life. And he goes, oh, yeah. Like when I was 6, I fell off the monkey bar and my head was crushed in an inch. No kidding. And then he found a video because they had to air ambulance him out of his small town where he lived to save his life. And they actually found a video where he was on the news. He was a little celebrity as a child. But it knocked his whole brain out, and as a result, he became a binge alcoholic. Now, so we have an anorexic, a binge alcoholic, and a lady who just can't function from a motor vehicle accident, and a lot of emotional issues, and was getting kind of OCD as well. And all of them had nearly identical brain signatures. Nearly identical.
See, Dave,
difficult to tell the apart.
And pardon me, I'm interrupting you. I just wanted to make sure you emphasize the several downstream effects that you've seen that are secondary to the brain injury that don't appear related to the average person, that could very easily be directly related to the brain injury, that could be actually corrected by doing recognize this DAI situation.
Yes, so it turns out the way I'm seeing it is that once you lose your cognitive ability and you lose your emotional regulation, a whole spectrum of things can happen. Who knows what you're going to do? Whether it's anorexia, whether it's binge alcohol, whether it's this or whether it's that. Because, all kinds of behaviors can spin off from they're basically the same behavior, but different, where people start to brace different activities. So the activity that you go towards, whether it's drinking or whether it's not eating or other things, is still caused from the same emotional cognitive cause.
Well, I thought that was good because you also mentioned earlier fever. I think, the idea of the subtlety of this situation is provocative, because people have these different, it wasn't a problem, it wasn't a big deal. In doing SPECT imaging, we would see a number of people that would have real SPECT imaging, functional brain imaging changes, and yes, that is what happened. But I think what you're saying is that there are a number of people beyond SPECT imaging that have significant problems that don't show on MRI or SPECT at all.
Yes, and I can't speak for SPECT so much, but certainly MRI. And that was one of the things, I talked to the panel at this concussion conference. I said, they talk about how they can't see those on MRIs. And I said, well, don't you guys ever use EEGs? They're way cheaper than an MRI. And they go, we've never done an EEG. I go, man, it jumped right out at you. You can't miss it. You just can't miss it. When you know what you're looking for, it jumps right out. And so I have a big hurdle now to try to get that community to actually believe me. But we'll see what happens, But so meanwhile, yes, it's been, and of course, if you're treating the brainwaves, that's nice, but you actually have to still treat the person at the end of the day. So I have these psych forms called an SCL90, symptom checklist, and there's 90 questions on it. And they look at 8 different measures of your emotional and cognitive ability. Like it measures pain, it measures obsessive compulsiveness, attention, depression, anxiety, somatization, things like this. And the norm on that scale is a 50. And most of my clients coming in are scoring 100 or in around that range. And they're kind of rough shape. Their self-assessment is that they're in fairly rough shape. Right after entrainment, literally after that first session of entrainment, they will drop to like a 70 or a 60 within the hour in terms of their self-assessment. But I typically do a 2 or 3 week follow-up. And at the 2 or 3 week follow-up, they're typically scoring a 10 or a 15, which is way below average. And in a few months, they're often down to a 5 or a 10 and doing way better. And they're back to work. This binge alcoholic now hasn't drank for a few months. And I mean, he was a really rough case. They were going to put him on some terrible drugs that make you sick when you drink, but they're very hard on the system. And he'd been in and out of rehab centers constantly.
That is so interesting. So interesting. Let me ask you this question.
Yes.
Because I know a number of people are thinking about this.
As soon as he used it, he quit drinking for 3 weeks, but then he had some repeats. But now he has now stopped.
I'm sorry I interrupted you. So did you go back and retrain him then? Or did he just worked on himself in a recovery process?
Oh, well, they have to do this daily.
Oh, they do? Okay.
But the gear is only $300 or $400, so they go home with it. When they wake up in the morning, they pop it on. They run a session for about 30 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes, and it resets their brain for the day. And typically after a couple of months, they don't need it anymore.
How do they determine, or how do you work with them? Do they come to see you, get evaluated, and know which piece of equipment to use and how to use it? How does all that happen?
Well, first thing I have to do, generally speaking, I mean, you can kind of guesstimate because certainly this technology doesn't hurt anyone. And so they could just trial and error it. But I prefer that they come in and they get a brain map done, see how they're doing, an EEG. And then we also process that EEG. They call it a quantitative EEG. We plug it into a database. We see how they compare against norms in the normal population. But I like to do that first to make sure I differentiate the diffuse axonal interruption from other issues. So I know exactly what they should be placing. I should be placing them on with a fair degree of confidence. And then I send them home with the gear and I have them fill out these indexes. Of course, I can track them, make sure they're doing well. And so far, unfortunately, this for a whole decade, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've missed a lot of people in years past because we didn't understand that signature and what the underlying physiology was about.
That is so interesting. Now, is that test, that 90, is it SCL 90?
Yes.
Is that publicly available, or is that your own test, or how does that work?
No, it's actually an established psych test that's normed.
Okay.
And you can see the questions on the internet. They're all over the internet, but the scoring key, you have to buy the scoring key.
I got you.
A lot of psychologists have it. They pay $1 a form or $5 a form, and they can give it to their clients, and their clients can fill it out and pay a fee to do that and crunch it.
That is terribly interesting. Now, this has been a very interesting, a lot of it, quite frankly, is over my head. I think I began to grasp it a little bit as we were going over it here. The good news is our listeners can, because we don't live in this reality. I mean, you're talking about brain waves, you're talking about the interaction of brain waves, then you're talking about actually manipulating brain waves in a completely unorthodox way.
Yeah.
And so it's a little sketchy from a point of view of like, oh my gosh, this is almost unreal in a certain respect. But what's provocative is the response that you've had from people that you've worked with. I think that's really, really interesting.
And I've worked with people who've been through the system for years with zero improvement. And they're fixed like in a half an hour, they're doing better. Yes, I know it sounds very bizarre. And that's one of the things about audio-visual entrainment. When I got involved in it way back in 1984, I built the first system to help students overcome stage fright. It wasn't my idea. I was into hardcore research at the university on TMJ dysfunction, but an instructor in performing arts had heard of me designing crazy things and asked me to build this device. And I thought it was hocus pocus, blinking lights. I mean, that was ridiculous, new age nonsense. And then I was struggling myself with a lot of anxiety and issues like that myself. So I started using it on myself. and it was really helping me recover from my own anxiety. And then I started using it on our TMJ patients, and then we published a study in '88 showing how remarkable it was at helping reduce their pain and helping them to recover. And then I thought, this is really important science, but it's going to die a new age fad if I don't do something about it. So I have personally funded 24 studies, and they're still ongoing. We have 2 PTSD studies in the work. We have one on student and executive stress and anxiety, how it impedes performance at McGill University. It's just starting up now. One on firefighters. I'm trying to keep the research ongoing because blinking lights do look hokey pokey, but they're really powerful. They really are powerful at the end of the day.
Well, I think a lot of things that are going over in neuroscience, when you're in a new field, when you're in a different language, when you're in a different conceptual system, it looks hokey pokey until you see the results. And then you look for explanations. And I really appreciate the time that you've taken to help our listeners and help me personally understand things that we can do to improve on people who are seriously stuck. Treatment failure is a big deal in the world, globally.
Oh, yes. And so many people with issues, they say, well, come on, smarten up. Quit being such a mess. Or they put them on meds that mess them up more. And really, a simple technique like lights and sounds, flashing at the correct frequencies can fix them right up. On the sports side, too, I know enough guys who do sports peak performance training for athletes. And we've had many athletes use the entrainment. Like Glenn Eller got gold in the Olympics, and he was using our 2 months after he started using our gear. Christine Boudre got silver in the Olympics a few months after using our gear. It just boosted them to another level of excellence. But one of the things that again, at this concussion conference, they interviewed this doctor who's an expert in sports injuries. And he said that they do these cognitive tests, and they can tell if they've got an axonal injury because their cognition goes down. And the question was posed, well, don't people ever fudge their baseline tests? No. People are always very, very honest and so on. So then I started talking to other guys who work in sports, and they say they always fudge their baseline tests because if they have an injury, then it's not detectable. But you can't bluff the EEG. You can't fool it. It knows. So
you can't fool it with a trained guy like you. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, you can fool the experts, but they're not going to fool me. Maybe put it that way.
No, that's very, very interesting. Listen, I'm looking at the time. It's so much fun talking to you. We do have to wind up. Let's wind up by taking a moment, if you will. Dave Siever, please tell us where people can get a hold of you, what your website is, anything you would like us to know as we close down.
Okay, well, my website is mindalive.com. And to learn all about this research, I've got studies on ADD, on college students, on post-traumatic stress disorder, on an endless number of topics. I have stuff on cranial electrostim, stuff on the transcranial DC stimulation as well. And so go to mindalive.com, click on the research tab, and the top listing says research articles by Dave Siever, though I think we're going to change it to just research articles on AVE, CES, and TDCS. Anyway, click on that, and you'll see a whole bunch of articles that have been published over the years, and read away. Yeah. Otherwise, the email address, our general email address is avedave. Go to info@mindalive.com.
That's great. I'm writing it down. I'll put it in the show notes. This has been very, very interesting. It really fits exactly what our mission is here at Core Brain, because we're really trying to take experts like you and take it right down to the street level, because there are a lot of people out there that are going to absolutely love this information. This is really first-class dialogue. You're a very interesting guy, and I want to thank you very, very much for taking the time with us.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate your interest in what we do and having us on your show. Thank you very much.
I will do it again sometime.
Thanks for listening to Core Brain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications, like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF
packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make a difference.